The last stern-wheeler of the season had gone down the river an hour before, and with it went the last easy way out of the country. Della stood on the landing at Cold Forks with her boots in the slush, and watched the smoke from its stack thin out over the canyon until there was nothing left of it but a smell. The water had turned the color of pewter. The far bank was already going white. She had $4 when she stepped off that boat at noon, and now she had none, because a woman in a green traveling cloak had sat beside her in the saloon of the steamer, asked her ever so kindly where she was bound, poured her a cup of tea, and somewhere between Soda Creek and the Forks had opened the seam of Della's reticule with a blade as fine as a hair, and left her with lint and a Bible and a pair of embroidery scissors. She had not cried about it. Crying cost something, and she had learned that summer exactly how little she had to spend. The roadhouse keeper at the Forks was not a cruel man. He was only a tired one. He stood in his doorway with a lamp behind him, and looked at her wet skirts and her hollow face, and said he was sorry, miss, but the campmen were 3 to a bed already, and he didn't run a charity, and if she had no coin she had no room, and that was the size of it. Then he shut the door, and she heard the bolt go across, and the warm yellow square of his window went dark a minute later as he carried the lamp away into the back of the house. So she put her back against the cold-board wall of the freight shed, where the wind couldn't get a straight run at her, and she dug her nails into her palms, and she did the arithmetic of her own, dying the way you'd reckon a column of figures you already knew the sum of. It was the first hard snow of the year. The flakes came down fat and wet and clung to her lashes. Across the yard a man was loading a freight sleigh by lantern light, swinging hundredweight sacks of flour up onto the bed as if they were pillows, and a pair of big-boned horses stood in the traces with frost already furring their muzzles. He was the size of a thing you'd see in a bad dream, shoulders like a doorframe, a fur cap pulled down to his brows, and a beard gone grey at the edges. He paid her no mind at all. He cinched his load down under a tarpaulin, checked each knot with a hand the size of a skillet, and went round to talk low to his horses, and the whole time Della watched him and gripped the little steel scissors in her coat pocket, because they were the only thing she owned that came to a point. When he'd done with the horses, he came back round the sleigh, and he looked across the yard at her, not the way men usually looked, not measuring what she might be worth. He looked at her the way you'd look at a calf that had got out through a broken fence and was now standing in the road and would have to be dealt with one way or another before you could get on with your evening. "You'll freeze sitting there," he said. His voice came up out of him, slow, like water out of a deep well. "I'll manage," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He turned back to his horses and laid a hand on the near one's neck, and she thought, "That's it, then. He's going." And the thought went through her like a draught of cold water, because he was the last living soul in the yard, and when he was gone there would be only her, and the snow and the bolted doors. "There's no one's going to open up for you tonight," he said, not turning round. "I know it. They know it. You'll be dead by the morning whistle, if there is one." He coiled a length of lead rope over his arm. "I've a place up the valley. Fire's banked. There's stew on, or there will be by the time we're up. Come along and eat, or don't. I'll not stand here in the weather to argue it." It was not an invitation. There was nothing soft in it. It was a man telling her the plain shape of the night, the way he might tell a stranger which fork in the road ran to the ferry. She thought of the scissors in her pocket. She thought of every story she had ever heard about men who lived alone in the high country and went years without the sight of a woman. And then the wind came down off the snowfields and went straight through her wet wool and into the marrow of her, and she thought, very clearly, and without any drama at all, that if he meant to do her harm, at least it would be indoors by a fire, and that this was the whole of the choice she had left. She picked up her one carpet bag and walked across the yard to him. "Della," she said, because it seemed she ought to give him something. He looked at her a moment. "Gideon," he said, and that was all. He took the bag from her hand before she could stop him, set it under the tarpaulin, and jerked his chin at the seat. "Up you get. Mind the wheel, hub. It'll have you over." The bench was hard as a church pew, and there were no springs to speak of. He pulled a buffalo robe out from under his own legs and dropped it across her lap, without a word, then chirruped to the horses, and they leaned into the collars, and the sleigh broke loose from the frozen ruts with a crack. The lantern swung from its hook by the dash and threw long, mad shadows up into the timber as they climbed. They climbed a long time. The road gave out into a trail, and the trail gave out into a notion of a trail, marked only by the blazes Gideon had cut years before into the trunks of the big lodgepoles, pale wounds in the bark that the lantern caught one after another out of the dark. The snow came down harder the higher they went. He sat hunched against it, the reins loose in his fists, and he did not say one word in an hour, and Della, who had spent her whole life among people who never stopped talking, sat beside him, with her teeth going like a telegraph key, and her hand wrapped round her useless little scissors, and felt the silence press on her, like a hand on the back of her neck. She was entirely at his mercy, and she knew it. He could turn the team off into the timber here, and no living person in the world would ever know what had become of her. Her father was dead. Her mother was dead. The man she was running from believed her gone to the coast, and if he ever learned different, it would only be to come and finish what he'd started. "Are we close?" she said at last, hating how thin the words came out. "Horses smell the barn," Gideon said. "Quarter hour." It was nearer 20 minutes, but then the timber fell back on both sides, and the trail opened into a clearing, and through the falling snow she saw the squared-off shape of a cabin, low and long, the chinking pail between the dark logs, and a thread of grey smoke standing up straight out of the stone chimney before the wind tore it sideways. There was a barn behind it, and a lean-to, and a corral with a single horse in it that lifted its head and whickered to the team. "Whoa!" said Gideon, and drew them up. He climbed down stiff and went round and dropped the tailgate, but he did not reach for her. He went to the horses first. He led them under the lean-to, out of the weather, and he stripped the harness off them and hung it on its pegs, and he forked them down a feed of hay and broke the skin of ice on the water trough with the heel of his boot, and he did all of it without hurry, while Della sat on the freight sleigh in the cold, with the robe round her shoulders. And she understood, watching him, that the beasts came first because the beasts had done the work, and that there was a whole order to a man's living up here that had nothing to do with her at all, and would go on with or without her. Only when the horses were rubbed down and eating did he come back. "Down you get," he said. She tried. Her legs had gone to wood somewhere on the climb, and they would not hold her. She got one foot to the ground, and the knee folded, and she would have gone face first into the snow if his hand hadn't shot out and closed round her arm. His grip was hard enough to leave marks, but there was nothing unkind in it. It was the grip of a man catching a falling sack of meal. "Feet are gone," he said, more to himself than to her, and then, with a sigh that seemed to come up from his boots, he stooped and put one arm behind her knees and one across her back and lifted her clear off the ground as if she weighed no more than the buffalo robe, and she gasped and got her arms round his neck because there was nothing else to hold. He smelled of wood smoke and horse and pine pitch and something underneath that was just clean and warm. He carried her up the 2 steps and shouldered the heavy door open and set her down in a chair by the hearth. And then he went straight back out into the storm. She heard him bringing in the freight he'd want for the night, heard the thump of a flour sack going onto the table, heard him cross to the lean-to and back. The cabin was nearly dark, lit only by the red glow of banked coals behind the iron grate. She sat where he'd put her and shook and looked about. It was a spare place, but not a poor one. Shelves of jars put up against the winter, onions and turnips in a bin, a long rifle on 2 pegs above the door, snowshoes, traps, a single narrow bunk along the far wall under a bearskin, a table planed smooth from use, 1 bunk. She saw that, and her stomach went tight, and her hand crept back toward her pocket. Gideon came in stamping snow, dropped an armload of split wood into the box, and crouched at the hearth. He raked the banked coals open, and laid kindling across them and blew, low and steady, and the dry pine caught, and the flame ran up yellow, and the whole room came awake in the light of it. He swung a kettle on its iron arm, in over the fire, and a black pot beside it, and lifted the lid of the pot, and gave whatever was in it a stir. "Soaked the beans before I went down," he said, as if she'd asked. "And there's a hair in there from the morning snare and barley. It's been on the back of the stove all day on a low coal. Won't be long." He hung the lid back. "Get those boots off before your feet thaw inside them, or you'll wish you hadn't." Her fingers wouldn't do the laces. She fumbled at the frozen knots and got nowhere, and after a moment he crossed the room and knelt in front of her, and brushed her hands aside, not roughly, and worked the wet leather loose himself with a patience that surprised her. He peeled the boots off, and then her sodden stockings, and she shut her eyes, mortified past speech, at the sight of her own bare grey feet in this stranger's 2 hands. But he didn't linger over them. He turned them once to the light, frowned at the white at the toes, and set them down. "Not froze," he said. "Near it. Don't put them at the fire. They've to come back slow, or it'll hurt worse than anything you've known." He stood. "Wrap that robe round them." He made the bannock while the stew finished, working dough in a wooden bowl with 3 fingers, frying it golden in a pan of drippings, and the smell of it filled the cabin and made Della's stomach clench so hard it ached. When he handed her a tin plate heaped with stew and a torn round of hot bannock she meant to eat like the woman she had been raised to be, small bites back straight. She managed perhaps 2, then something in her that had been holding on for 2 days simply let go, and she ate the way an animal eats, tearing the bread, scraping the plate, burning the roof of her mouth, and not caring, and when it was gone she wiped the tin clean with a lap the last of the bannock, and licked the grease off her thumb before she could stop herself. She looked up. He was watching her utter over his own plate, and the shame came up her neck in a hot flood. "I'm sorry," she said. "I haven't eaten." He finished for her, and looked back down at his food. "It's no sin to be hungry. Eat the rest of mine if you've room." He'd already set half his portion aside on the table near her. He'd done it before she finished, she realized. He'd known. That night he gave her the bunk. She said no, she couldn't. It was his, and he said that a man who'd slept on the ground half his life could sleep on the floor of his own house one night, and not die of it, and he laid out a hide and a Hudson's Bay blanket by the hearth, and lay down on it, with his boots still on and his back to the room. He blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark under the bearskin, and listened to the storm work at the cabin, and listened to him breathe, slow and even, and she waited for the breathing to change, for the floor to creak, for the thing that always came. It did not come, and somewhere in the long middle of the night, when she finally understood that it was not coming, that this enormous, silent man across the room had fed her and warmed her and asked for nothing, and was simply asleep, a single tear ran down the side of her face into her hair, and then another, and she pulled the bearskin over her head and cried without a sound, not out of fear, but out of the terrible relief of being, for one night, safe. The storm did not let up at dawn. It did not let up the next day or the day after. It settled in over the high country like something with a grudge, and the world shrank down to the 4 log walls and the fire, and the 2 of them in it. The silence nearly broke her. She was used to a house full of noise, the rattle of her mother's sewing machine, the shriek of the kettle, the low, constant voice of the man she'd run from, soft as oil, always reasonable, always right up until it wasn't. To Della, quiet had always meant danger, gathering. Gideon could sit a whole morning mending a snowshoe and not say 10 words, and she would pace from the hearth to the table and back until she thought she'd scream. "Do you never talk?" she said, on the second day, and it came out sharper than she meant. He didn't look up from the rawhide he was lacing. "When there's a thing wants saying. And there's never a thing wants saying. Not so often as people think." He pulled the lacing tight. Out here a body learns the difference between noise and need. She laughed, and it had a cracked edge to it. "We are buried alive in a box of logs, and you mend a snowshoe." "Snowshoe'll want mending whether I'm easy in my mind or not," he said. "And we're not buried. It's only weather. It comes every year about now, and it goes about April." He set the snowshoe down at last and looked at her, and his eyes went over her, the wild hair, the trembling hands, the wet collar she'd been wearing 2 days. "You're standing up," he said. 3 nights gone you were sitting down to die against a freight shed. Now you've the strength to be cross with a man over a snowshoe. That's not nothing." It stopped her where she stood. The plain truth of it took all the fight out of her at once, and left her swaying and emptied and ashamed. He sighed his old put-upon sigh, and got up and went to a cedar chest at the foot of the bunk, and rummaged in it and came up with a faded flannel shirt, red gone soft and pink with washing, and tossed it to her across the room. "That dress is damp through," he said. "Damp's what kills up here, not cold. Get it off, and that on, and hang the dress by the fire." He turned his broad back to her and went to work, jabbing at the coals, and never once turned round. And she stood in the corner, with her face to the logs, and her heart going, and unbuttoned her ruined dress with shaking fingers, and pulled his shirt on over her shift. It came near to her knees. It smelled of cedar and lye soap and wood smoke. Of him, and she rolled the sleeves up off her hands, and felt, standing there swallowed in another person's shirt, more exposed and more strangely safe than she had felt. In a year. It was on the 3rd afternoon, with the fire snapping and the wind soaring at the eaves, that she saw the scar. He'd pushed his own sleeve up to scrub a pot, and there it was on his forearm, a thick, ruined seam of white that ran up under the cloth, a thing no knife had ever made. He felt her looking and didn't cover it. "Grizzly," he said. "Sow, with cubs back in the willows I never saw, 8 winters past." He set the pot down, took the meat off me to the bone, and a piece out of my leg besides. I lay in the snow the best part of a night before I could crawl to the horse, and the horse brought me down the mountain on her own, God knows how, with me bleeding into her mane the whole way. He turned his arm to the light, not with any pride, just showing her the fact of it. She got her cubs clear. I got to keep most of the arm. I've made worse trades. "And you stayed," Della said. "After that, you didn't go down to where it's safer." "Safer? Where?" He said it flat, not as a question. "The towns are full of men. A bear only wants you off her ground. She's no interest in owning you. There's men I've known a body couldn't say that of." The word went into her, like a splinter she'd been carrying for months, and only now felt. Owning. She put her hand up to the base of her throat, without meaning to, where the collar of his shirt hid what was there, and Gideon's pale eyes followed her hand, and his face did not change, but something behind it went very still. He did not ask. He got up instead, and dragged a galvanized tub out of the corner to the middle of the floor, and began carrying the heated kettles to it and tempering them from the cold bucket, and laying out a square of rough toweling and a cake of yellow soap on a stool. "Water's hot," he said. "You've worn the road 3 days. Have a wash." She stared at the steaming tub in the open middle of the one-room cabin. "I can't," she said, and the color came up in her face. "There's nowhere." He didn't sigh this time. He simply took his fur cap and his heavy coat off the peg and put them on. "The stock wants seeing to anyhow," he said. "Snow's let up enough I can muck the lean-to and check on them. Bar the door behind me. Take your time. Knock on the shutter when you're decent and I'll know." He pulled the cap down. "Don't fall asleep and drown. I've trouble enough." And he went out into the cold and shut the door, and she heard him cross to the lean-to, and after a moment heard him talking low, and even to the horses, the only easy talk she had heard out of him, and she understood that he had not invented the chores. There were beasts out there that needed him, and he had simply arranged the truth of the evening so that she could have what she needed, and inside she barred the door, and she undressed in the firelight, and when she stepped into the brutal heat of the water, she had to bite down on a sob, and she scrubbed herself pink with the harsh soap, the mud, the fear, the smell of every mile she'd run, and she ducked her whole head under and felt 3 days come loose from her hair. When she'd dried and dressed again in his shirt and her own poor shift, she opened the shutter a crack and called that she was finished, and a minute later he came in white, with frost down to his eyebrows, having stood out in the snow long past any horse's need, and he didn't look at her at all. He dragged the tub to the door and tipped the grey water out into the dark and set it back in its corner, and he held his great red hands out to the fire and said, "Wood split, get some sleep." And that was all. On the 4th night the fever took her. She had felt it coming all day, an ache low in her back that spread out until her joints ground like grit, and a heat under her skin that no fire made. She'd hidden it, holding her jaw shut against the chatter of her teeth, because she'd known nothing but cost since she came north, and she would not be one more weight on this man's back. But it caught her at last with a cough that tore through the quiet room like canvas ripping, and bent her double in the chair. Gideon was up before the second cough finished. He crossed the room and laid the back of his hand to her forehead, and his rough, cool palm against her burning skin made her want to weep. "Feather," he said, his jaw set. "In the bunk. Now. It's yours," she got out. "I won't take You'll do as I say, or you'll die in that chair," he said, with no more heat than if he'd remarked on the snow. "And then I've to dig a grave in ground gone hard as iron, and I'll not get in the bunk." And when her legs wouldn't carry her there either, he simply gathered her up again, lighter now, frightening light, and laid her on the bearskin and drew it to her chin. He boiled willow bark and made her drink it, bitter as ash, his hand steady at her lip, until she'd swallowed every drop, and for a day and a night she went down into a place of heat and shadow, where the steamer rocked, and the woman in the green cloak smiled at her with a hair-fine blade, and Creel's soft voice said her name in the dark, and his thumbs found her throat, and she thrashed and fought the bearskin off, until a pair of hands closed gently round her wrists, and a deep voice she half knew said, "Hold still. You're all right. Hold still." She came up out of it some black hour, with a cool, wet cloth on her brow, and Gideon sitting on a crate at the bunkside, a basin of melted snow in his lap, wiping the sweat from her face. The cloth moved to her neck, and her collar had fallen open in her fever, and she felt his hand stop dead in the air. The marks were old by then, gone the color of a storm sky, yellow and grey-green, but there was no mistaking what they were, or what had made them. The print of a thumb and 4 fingers, pressed deep, the size of a man's hand round a woman's throat. She came awake enough to feel the room go still as stone. She snatched the bearskin to her chin, and her breath came fast and shallow, and Gideon did not ask who, or why, or whether she'd brought it on herself, the way she'd half learned to expect a man would. He looked at the bruises a long moment, and the muscles stood out along his jaw, and then he wet the cloth again in the cold basin, and folded it, and laid it on her forehead, and he very low, in a voice that had something underneath it like a river under ice. "Fever's turning. Go to sleep." And he did not touch her neck again. He sat the rest of the night on that crate between her and the door, and when toward dawn she surfaced once more, she saw that his rifle had come down off its pegs and lay across his knees, and his eyes were open, and they were on the latch. The fever broke with the storm. She woke to a silence so total her ears rang with it, and to white light pouring through the window, where for 4 days there had been only blown snow, and to the smell of bacon and strong tea. Gideon stood at the stove with his back to her, and beyond him the window showed a world drowned in snow, and dead still under a hard blue sky. She told him about Creel that morning, sitting up in the bunk, with a plate on her knees. Because of the way he'd looked at her throat in the night and not asked, she told him her father had died, owing money he'd hidden from them all, and that Crail had bought the paper on the debt and come to the house in his good coat with his gold watch, and said, so reasonably, that they whole. Some could be forgiven, that all that was wanted was for her to wear his ring and stand pretty at his side when his business friends came to dinner. She told him she'd believed she could do it, that she'd thought of it as a kind of accounts to be settled. And she told him what it had truly been, the soft voice that turned to iron behind a closed door. The hand at her throat the night she'd refused to sign over the last of her father's shares, and how she'd taken the cash from his desk drawer while he slept off his brandy, and got on the first boat heading anywhere he wasn't. Gideon listened to all of it without once looking at her, his eyes on the stove door, rolling a thin cigarette between his fingers and not lighting it. A man that puts his hands on a woman's no man, he said when she'd finished. He's a frightened thing, pretending at teeth. He pinched the cigarette in two and dropped it in his pocket unlit. Is he hunting you? The dread came back cold. He has money. Money buys men who find people. Gideon nodded slowly, as if she'd told him the weather. Pass'll be shut with snow till the thaw, he said. Nothing comes up this valley through 10 feet of drift. If he sends men, they'll come in the spring, up the canyon, single file, slow. He looked at her then, level and plain. And no one comes up that canyon, but I let them. It was not a vow. He made no promises about her honor or her heart. He offered her snow and a rifle, and a narrow trail, and it was the most steadying thing anyone had ever said to her in her life. The thaw, when it came at last, came fast. A warm wind ran up the valley out of the south and ate the drifts to slush in 3 days. Water ran everywhere, off the eaves, down the swollen creek, in heavy thumps off the loaded pine boughs. Della grew strong again. She took over the stove and burned the first 3 bannocks, and learned the trick of the 4th. Gideon let her. He split wood and cleared the roof, and ran his trap line, and they moved round each other in the small cabin, in a careful quiet that was no longer a cage but something more like a held breath, and neither of them said a word about the road, which was opening lower down the mountain a little more each day, brown and muddy through the white. On the 4th morning of the thaw he did not go to his line. She woke to the sound of harness, and she went to the window and wiped the steam from the glass, and saw him backing the team into the traces of the freight sleigh. Runners traded for wheels now in the bare mud of the yard. Her heart dropped straight through her. It was time then. The fever was gone, the road was open, and her charity was spent. She was a stray he'd taken in to weather a storm, and the storm was over. She turned from the window and made her hands stop shaking. She had nothing to pack. She folded the red shirt to give back and put on her own dress, dried stiff and shapeless, and waited, and would not cry. The door swung in and he stood filling it, mud to the knee, his coat still on. Team's hitched, he said. She gripped the back of the chair until her knuckles went white. She made her chin come up. I haven't much to gather, she said, and the brightness she put in her voice felt like it would split her face. What do I owe you? For the food, the medicine. He looked at her a long moment, at her straight spine and her tilted chin, the last threadbare scraps of the woman she'd been raised to be. Wagon road's clear to the forks, he said slowly. Boat comes up Thursday if the river's not too high. Old fellow at the roadhouse owes me a sack of flour. He'll put you up 2 nights for it. He paused. I told you the road was open. She nodded stiffly and reached for her carpet bag. Thank you for everything, she said, and started for the door. He didn't move out of it. She stopped a foot short of him, looking up. Let me by, please, she said, and the brightness cracked clean through. Gideon pushed his cap back off his brow with one thumb. I said the road was open, he said. I never said, get on it. The cabin went very still. Outside, a clump of snow let go of the roof and fell past the window with a soft, heavy sound. He looked away from her at the cold stove and shifted his weight, and she watched the discomfort move through him like a thing he had no practice carrying. "It's quiet up here," he said, low, the words coming hard, like stones turned over with a bar. "I've kept it that way 8 years on purpose. I'm not an easy man, and I'm not company." He brought his eyes back to her. "But I find I don't mind yours, that's all. I don't know how to say it better than that." Her breath went out of her. "Gideon," she started. "It's a hard life," he said over her, gentle but going on, laying the terms out honest. "Winters are long and the work doesn't quit, and there's no piano and no fine cloth, only mud and wood and weather." He lifted one great scarred hand, palm up, into the space between them, and he did not touch her with it. He left it open. "But you'll not be cold," he said, "and you'll not go hungry, and as long as there's breath in me, no man living will ever lay a hand on your throat again." He stood there, this enormous quiet man, more open and undefended than she'd thought him able to be. "It's yours to choose," he said. "The road's there, and he tipped his head toward the stove, toward the bannock pan and the banked fire. "Or you stay, and there's supper." She looked at his open hand. She thought of the boat and the river, and the long looking back over her shoulder for the rest of her life. She thought of the freight shed and the bolted door and the snow coming down. And then she thought of this room, and the willow bark, and the shirt that smelled of cedar, and the rifle laid across the latch in the dark. She let the carpet bag slide out of off thud. It hit the floor with her arms around him. She did not throw her arms, she did not weep. She only reached out and laid her small hand into the middle of his rough, enormous palm, and his fingers folded over it, warm and certain, an anchor in the whole turning world. "I expect," she said, and a smile she had not used in a year came loose across her face, "I can learn to make the fourth bannock the way you do." The corner of his mouth moved, the nearest thing to a smile she'd had off him yet. He squeezed her hand once and let it go, and he turned to the door and put his head out into the bright, wet morning. "Put the team up," he called to the yard, to the horses, to the open road below. "We're stopping home." Then he came back in and took off his coat and hung it on the peg and said the stove had gone low and the beans, for tomorrow wanted putting on to soak, and she went and stirred the coals up bright, and the sparks flew up the chimney into the thawing day. Winter wasn't done with the high country yet, but the cold had gone out of the house, and it did not come back.